Welcome to Art Toronto. My name is Mia Nielsen. I'm the director of the fair, and today we welcome Montreal artist Miles Greenberg. He's here to speak about his practice in performance, video, sculpture, and installation. Enjoy.
Late October is a piece that I originally created for 7 performers, a live performance in Galleria Continua Les Moulins outside of Paris. This piece was done with 7 performers who were sort of enacting this very elaborate sequence of actions in repetition, sort of in perpetuity over the course of 7 hours. And it took place in this scenography that I created that was built in response to this very large permanent installation and that occupies the space called Cave by Anish Kapoor. It was a tall order to respond to something so grandiose and so permanent in the space, especially coming from a practice that is so centered in the immaterial and the ephemeral somewhat, and I'd always wanted to do sculpture, sort of foreshadowing like where we're at here in this show, but it felt like a big assignment, and I just figured what could talk to a cave better than a crater. And so I decided to build this sort of this crater based off of this crater that I visited in Iceland called Kerith. I was also inspired really heavily by sci-fi aesthetically, and one of my biggest references in a lot of my work is Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. But this sort of atmosphere was kind of a nod to Tarkovsky's rendition. And the work that I do resides and relies so heavily on duration because it allows for a presence in the space that is sculptural. When you're operating on a scale of 7 or 9 or 24 hours, the piece no longer becomes linear, the piece no longer becomes watchable, right? It's also not choreographical. So it's completely something that manifests out of, a really natural encounter with the body and with the space and with the audience. At Arsenal, we've recreated the installation made to measure for the space. And inside of the water, instead of these performers, these sort of apparitions, we have these sculptures that I've created. These are my first ever sculptures. They stand life-sized. This has kind of generated so much more, and this is something that I'm really focused on in my work right now is creating one thing that can kind of decline into 100 things. And I really wish to explore the generative capacity of work, that especially work that comes from the immaterial and takes root in the body. I dropped out of CJEP when I was 17, is my educational background, to essentially experiment with my artistic practice. But I wanted to take a year to sort of figure out what my language was. I was aware of performance art from a pretty young age. I don't have a formal dance training, but I studied linguistics and various languages when I was living in Montreal. And so I acquired a sort of improvised background in 5 additional languages. I eventually moved to Beijing for a month to work for Edouard Lock as an intern for his workshop that he had there. And then while I was there, I ended up getting an artist residency and stayed on a little bit longer. But that was, I think, sort of where I started to experiment with things like photography. And I then ended up at École Jacques Lecoq in Paris shortly thereafter. And I lived there and did workshops there around the body and movement and architecture of space and architecture of the body. So really coming at the body from an architectural perspective. And that was really key in my sort of understanding spatiality and just general rules that don't necessarily have like a logical rule to them. Within that really led me, I think, to what I'm sort of doing now, because like those little subtle manipulations of space are I think, as key for me as anything that the performers are actually doing, right? I lived in Paris for about 3.5 years before moving to New York 2 years ago, where I've been living and working ever since. I think that Canadian artists have a particular sensibility to the world insofar as we're very permeable as a people, which I really appreciate more and more as I get older. I really see how adaptable we are to various sort of environments. I don't ever feel blocked by a cultural barrier. It's such a non-nationality that I feel like I have that allows me to be like fully committed to wherever I happen to be. And I think that is something that a lot of Canadian artists seem to have in common, is this ability to sort of melt into your surroundings and just be very open to them. And I think that that is particularly important when you're working with the body, because that openness and that sort of ability to pick up language and nuance is how we connect with one another fundamentally. I can also say, like, I think that there's been a growing awareness, in my generation for sure, of the fact that essentially none of us belong on the territory that we were born on, right? So I think that that's why there's this sort of this understanding that wherever we come from, it's sort of a privilege to be here, right? And that we have to look outwards to be connected to who we are. I think of being an artist from Canada, from Montreal, from Jacques, as being someone who innately has an outward gaze. COVID was my 22nd, 23rd, and coming up in 2 weeks, 24th year of life, right? So that's kind of indistinguishable from my general coming of age and trajectory. I mean, of course, we all had a lot of time to look inwards and examine what is necessary in terms of our cultural production, in terms of what we put out into the world, in terms of what we say, in terms of how we economize our actions, because it's been exhausting. And then I got opportunities around the world actually to create new work and to further my practice, in ways that were safe and, pushing actually the boundaries of even what I do, right? And this, I think, is such a beautiful and elegant apex to that, because in the beginning it was performances with no public. I love restrictions, in general. You have to push that much harder when there are barriers. Like this show to me is like really like the pinnacle, I think, of that trajectory. This is a show where I've communicated the body, but there are no physical bodies. I think that this for me feels like a full circle of sorts to really explore a performance, as a fundament, right? As an idea, but not necessarily strictly as a medium. But, in truth, I feel that everything that I do, whether it be sculpture, whether it be video, whether it be, eventually maybe one day painting or photographs, I want to think of them as bodies. And I think that if it feels like a body, then I've been successful. That's it.